Hi, I'm Tracy Millian Simmons from Emporia, Kansas. I am the owner of Meadowlark Press. Thank you for inviting us to the Kansas Library Association conference.
I've been a book lover for as long as I can remember, and I wasn't only reading them, I was making them. Beginning with the junior high newspaper, I began seeing myself as a story keeper, someone who preserved events and told the stories of our time. Having spent most of my adult life writing and working behind the scenes for assorted book publishers of all sizes and various publications, Meadowlark began with a green bike. It was 2014, and this group novel by Kevin Rabus, Michael Graves, and myself began the Meadowlark journey. Today, we are an independent press with a focus on Midwest regional authors. We publish memoir, poetry, short stories, and novels. To date, we have published 28 books and counting. In 6 short years, we have published 2 Kansas notable titles. To Leave a Shadow kicked off the Pete Stone series of private investigator stories. Set in historically accurate 1930s Wichita, Michael D. Graves created the character of Pete Stone as a memorial to his grandfather, and the book was featured as a 2020 Iola Community Reads selection. Headwinds tells the story of the air base coming to Liberal, Kansas, and the beginning of what would become the Marysville Municipal Airport after World War II. Headwinds tells of a time when families headed for the airfield after church on Sundays to watch pilots train, and Edna Bell Pearson, the author, was a pilot in training as well. We've published a Nelson Poetry Book Award winner. Stage Whispers features poetry by Roy Beckemeyer, a multi-year Poet of the Year for Kansas Authors Club, among his many accolades. We've also published 2 Martin Kansas History Book Awards. A Cow for College is a short story memoir collection depicting growing up on a farm in 1950s Graham County, Kansas. Golden Rule Days, the same author, James Kenyon, made 12 trips across Kansas to visit every county in the state, collecting stories of former Kansas high schools as he went. And finally, just awarded this month, a J. Donald Coffin Memorial Book Award. Detective Pete Stone is back in this 3rd book of the series. A young woman is stabbed to death in Wichita. Within hours, police nab a suspect. The case open and shut until a university professor calls on Pete Stone to prove that the suspect is innocent. But in my mind, all of our titles are award winners because they tell the stories of people like us. Meadowlark books feature people who grew up under big skies or fell in love with them later in life. Meadowlark authors don't think of landlocked as a negative, and they have a special affinity for small towns, being neighborly, for adventures far and away, and for coming home again. Meadowlark is the home of the Birdie Poetry Prize, which features a cash prize and publication for poets in its 3rd year in 2021. And we are very excited to announce a new literary venture with Quincy Press. 105 Meadowlark Reader is a Kansas journal of creative nonfiction to be published twice yearly. Today, I would like to introduce you to 3 Meadowlark authors who have published books in 2020. These Kansas-centric stories will ground you, inspire you, and give you a moment of respite from these turbulent times. Julie Stielstra is the author of Meadowlark's very first YA novel. This is the story of Katie Myrtle, a young woman from Chicago who finds herself with relatives in Kansas for the summer after her father's suicide. I'm just going to say that I was captured by Katie's story from the start, and I am so pleased to include this title on the Meadowlark bookshelf.
Good Good morning, everyone. I'd just like to start by saying how absolutely delighted I am to have been invited to talk to you this morning, largely because you are my tribe. I have been a professional librarian for many, many years. I've worked in public, university, government. I did a stint in an art museum, and most recently medical libraries for a very long time. And nothing would please me more than to have you all interested in my novel, Opulence, Kansas, to share with your patrons and your communities. I'm sharing the panel today with three people with deep roots in Kansas, and I guess you could say I'm coming in as the outsider. I was born and raised in Michigan. I've lived in Ohio and Arizona, and most recently, unfortunately, the Chicago area. And I didn't set foot in Kansas until I was 40 years old. And even then, that was on the drive out to Colorado, where my husband and I and our two dogs would go on camping and hiking and birdwatching adventures. And we would split the trip halfway across in Great Bend. Well, one spring, after I had started to become pretty seriously interested in birdwatching, I discovered Cheyenne Bottoms north of Great Bend. And I literally sat in a chair there and watched this amazing parade of birds, of herons and grebes and coots and ibises and egrets and godwits. And they all just paddled and floated and trailed by practically at my feet. Plus, there were coyotes and turtles and snakes and muskrats, and I felt like Snow White in the Enchanted Forest with all the little forest creatures coming out to meet her. So ultimately, we just ditched Colorado and we just kept coming back to Kansas for 20 odd years. We used to get off the Kansas Turnpike at Admire, which is just still one of the most gloriously lovely places I know of. And when we would turn off that turnpike at Admire and head west on 56, we would look at each other and go, yes, we're here. We're in Kansas now. At that exit was a little one-person toll booth, which inspired me to write a short story that was published in the New Plains Review out of Nebraska. A few years later, Potomac Review published another short story I did about a young art student in Chicago who carries the ashes of a friend out to Cheyenne Bottoms to be scattered. Ultimately, we bought a house 5 miles from Cheyenne Bottoms, and I set another story right there about a lonely young man keeping bees, learning to join a community, a local community. And a good part of Opulence actually takes place right in that house. It belongs to the couple who feature as an important aspect of that story. So clearly something in this place under these skies just nourishes my soul and my imagination and my creativity and gave me this desire to just explore it somehow, capture it, and share it in writing. So writing Opulence became my sort of larger scale effort to describe the experience of discovering a place which is completely unlike anywhere else I'd ever lived and falling in love with it and how it can change you. I wanted to explore the contrasts that I found of urban versus rural, the vertical versus horizontal, the crowding and congestion versus a sense of community, privilege versus labor, just all these different contrasts that I saw. And the way into a story like this, of course, is the old fish out of water trope where you take a character and drop her into an unfamiliar environment and see what she learns and how she copes. And it became a YA novel, and not because I am a YA writer in any meaningful sense, but rather that process of discovery and change just seemed to fit with the coming of age and rites of passage and that expansion of awareness and consciousness that seems to come along with adolescence. But as I tackled this YA genre, I did consider some writers who do write for youth. I didn't exactly go looking for them as models or to do research, but rather they were just writers that I had heard of or read reviews of or discovered on my own that I read and had really enjoyed. And I will tell you that this year I've been on the judging panel for a YA fiction competition run by the state of Illinois library system. And if I see one more multi-volume, post-apocalyptic, dystopian fantasy novel, I think I'm going to cry. There was a day that I was at our local public library back when they were still open, and I picked up a new book off the YA shelf about a teenaged girl who is kidnapped, raped, and tortured by a boy who then commits suicide in front of her. And I thought, if this is the market, I am totally doomed. But then I thought about Claire Vanderpool and John Green and Rebecca Stead and Lauren Wolk and Kate DiCamillo and Mark Haddon and yes, Philip Pullman. I'm not totally rigid about those fantasy trilogies. I really loved his Dark Materials trilogy. But all of them have these humane voices with heart and some tenderness and wonderful, wonderful writing. And so I would like to think that Opulence is that kind of book or aspires to be that kind of book. As we settled into our adopted community of Ellenwood, I started learning about the history of the town and its surroundings and its buildings. And I ran into other stories from Kansas history. One that really struck me was about the failed planned community of Runnymede in southern Kansas in the late 19th century, which was built to attract the younger sons of English nobility. So some of these stories and elements became the building blocks for the town of Opulence. It became the setting for a privileged but not spoiled teenaged girl, Katie Murdahl, coming in from the big city to learn about the gifts and the richness and the challenges of a very different kind of a place. Place is very central to this story, as seen through the eyes of someone seeing it for the first time. It's so central that when I finished writing it, I thought, well, what am I going to do with this story? I'd had the short stories published. A little historical novel I wrote called Pilgrim won a novella contest with Minerva Rising Press a few years ago. But I'd never peddled a novel with queries and pitches to agents, and all the agents seem to work out of New York City. And I just thought, how are these folks going to look at this quiet little novel that doesn't have any axe battles or vampires or teenage superheroes and set in Kansas of all places, right? I did not consider self-publication. I am a librarian and I know how tight your budgets are and how carefully you need to select what you put in your collections for your patrons and your community. So I thought, well, maybe I can find a publisher that's based in the Plains, in the Midwest, even in Kansas, who would be willing to look at a story like this. So I Googled up Independent Presses Kansas, which took me to the Poets and Writers website, which has a directory of independent presses. So I typed in Kansas, and the very first hit was Meadowlark Books. So I combed through their website and their memoirs and books of poetry and fiction, which all had a Kansas angle. And I really liked how the books looked. I liked how they looked. I liked what kinds of stories they were. And so I packed up my manuscript and sent it in. After the reading period closed, Tracy posted about this amazing array of wonderful stories and manuscripts that they'd received and how she just wished that she could publish them all. And I kind of sighed and went, oh, well, okay, it was worth a shot. It wasn't a bad idea, but oh, well. And then I got the email from Tracy saying that she wanted to publish Opulence, which made me so happy. And we were off on our publishing adventure, which resulted in this little book with my name on the cover. And I do want to tell you that the cover was also a Kansas product from a friend of mine in Great Bend, a wonderful birder and fabulous photographer called Jay Miller. I sought him out for his photographs because I knew he would capture what I thought of as the gorgeousness and the opulence of the Kansas landscape. I confess I have some mixed feelings about my desire to share the beauties and the charms of the state, which has completely captivated me. I don't particularly want any other people from Chicago to move here. Maybe we should just keep this our little secret because we like it just fine, just the way it is. But I hope that you real Kansans will enjoy this story from an outlander who is trying to express her sincere affection for a state that should not just be a flyover, but should be crossed and explored and appreciated. And thank you very much.
And next we have Jerilynn Jones Henrikson, an author from Emporia. Jarelyn has lived her life loving the rolling flint hills of east central Kansas. Most of her writings are designed to appeal to the very young, with clever rhymes and engaging situations featuring Kansas as a background. This story, A Time for Tears, is a departure. Listening to her father's experiences and remembering his return from World War II raised questions that, with time, grew into a demanding desire for answers. What was the impact of this war on children her own age, who found themselves in the middle of conflict? Jarelyn felt compelled to write this story. The book, a result of research, memories, and imagination, is designed to inform young adult readers of today about this terrible time for tears.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jerilynn Jones Henrikson, and I have written a young adult historical fiction book titled A Time for Tears, which chronicles the lives of 3 young people during the World War II in France, each of them taking their separate journeys and finally meeting up to create this story. You'll notice in the background this lovely scene, and this was taken from a riverboat of a house on the bank. And when we went by this place, I saw this house and was really enchanted by it and had my husband Dwayne take a picture. And it is to be the cover of the book. So I'm really excited that both of us have input into this story. I was inspired to write the story by a trip to France that we took in 2018 when we saw this house. We also ran into a lady in the town of Vienne. I was sitting on a bench and Dwayne was off taking pictures, and it was kind of rainy and misty and there weren't very many people out. And she went striding by me as I sat there on the bench, and she kind of looked down at me and took note of my clunky white shoes. And she was all dressed up and just looked beautiful, and she was wearing high heels, walking on those cobbles that practically crippled me. So she inspired me, and I thought of her as living in this house because it's tall and narrow just like she was. Now, originally I thought of a children's book because that's been my forte up until now. I like to write books for kids. So I thought about maybe the title would be The Tallest, Most Beautiful Old Lady in France. And I had visions of her living in this house with her short, round, balding husband. But as the story progressed in my mind, it became much more serious and more of a young adult story. At any rate, I began thinking about this story, and one of my inspirations was kind of the current rise of a return to fascism, which I find very disturbing. And I thought perhaps a story about this time from the point of view of some young people might be apropos for the time. So anyway, I began thinking about writing the story, and then I could hear this little voice in the back of my head that kept saying, but you're only supposed to write about things you know about. So I set about finding out more about this time period. Now, my own dad was involved in World War II, and he was a tank commander, a sergeant, and was involved in the Battle of the Bulge. And during that battle, his tank took a hit and he was thrown free, but the rest of his crew was killed in that battle. And it had a terrible effect on him for the rest of his life. And at that time, nobody had heard of or thought about something such as PST. And so he was kind of, I guess they might have called it shell shock, but it really made an impact on the rest of his life. And that also inspired me to write this story. So I began with talking to some of my friends, one of whom is Marjorie Worley, and Marjorie's dad, Keith Witt, had volunteered early to go overseas and be in the RAF. And he was a glider pilot. And I thought, well, it would be cool to have one of my characters follow that path. And part of Keith and Marjorie's story was that he left the day she was born. And I included that as a detail in the story. Then from there, I began doing some reading, and there were 3 particular books that kind of helped me fill in my knowledge. One of which is called The Wolves at the Door. And this story is about Virginia Hall, who was an American diplomat in Poland. And from there, she got involved with the SOE, which was a group of commandos organized by Churchill. And she became perhaps the most important leader in the resistance. It was through her that most of the funding from Britain went into the French resistance. And her story is remarkable. I also read a book called The Saboteur, and it is about an aristocrat named Robert de la Rochefoucauld, and he was also a very important commando. In fact, he was captured by the Nazis twice and escaped both times. And in both of those instances, he had to kill somebody to get loose. He was only 17 when he got involved. Then I also read a book called A Village of Secrets, and it's about the village Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, which is an important part of my story. It's a village where the local Huguenot population saved probably as many as 5,000 Jewish people. And that town had become renowned as a place of refuge. During the Spanish Civil War, if people were fleeing the plague or tuberculosis, this was a place in the Haute-Loire region of France where they could go up to the mountains. It was cooler, the air was fresher. They ate a lot of vegetables, and many of them recovered from diseases and found refuge there from all kinds of problems. Then I also read a little book by Robert Hébras called The Tragedy Hour by Hour. And this is about the little town of Oradour-sur-le-Glane, which was destroyed by the Nazis shortly after the D-Day landings. And it is now, it's a memorial. It was designated as such by by President Charles de Gaulle shortly after the war. When he passed through it, he was so taken by the tragedy that he declared it to be a memorial. And you can walk through it if you visit France today, and you have to be quiet. It's like a sanctuary. It's like it's a holy place, and it was declared to never be rebuilt and left as is. So the story begins with each of the 3 families of these 3 people and how they got involved into the war. And it progresses as they meet up with each other. They also meet a really bad Nazi. You have to have a terrible villain, to make a good story. And so he fits the bill. He's blue-eyed and very handsome, but his eyes are like ice. And he's a very wicked man, and he doesn't hesitate to kill children, old people. He's I think he's quite a successful villain. At any rate, I enjoyed the research. I enjoyed people helping me. I had several friends that read through different iterations of the story and made suggestions, and I've really enjoyed the process, and now I hope to enjoy the rewards. And Tracy is helping me with Meadowlark Books, and I'm excited for that collaboration. Thank you for listening.
And now I am pleased to introduce Michael D. Graves. Mike's first Pete Stone novel, To Leave a Shadow, was selected as a 2016 Kansas Notable Book, giving Meadowlark quite a start. That book was followed by Shadow of Death, and this year, All Hallows Shadows, the third Pete Stone novel, was selected as a 2020 J. Donald Coffin Memorial Book Award winner. Mike was instrumental in the start of Meadowlark as an author of Greenbike, and his Pete Stone series, in the beginning he told me there would be only one, has become a cornerstone of the Meadowlark bookshelf.
Hello, and thank you for letting me speak with you today. My name is Mike Graves. I have written a series of detective novels set in 1937 Wichita. The character's name is Pete Stone. And I'd like to talk to you a little bit about how this character came to be and how I did the research for these books. And specifically, I want to make sure that I thank you for the help that you've shown and given me as I do my research. Pete Stone is a character in 1937 Wichita, and he was born when I recalled my grandfather's last words to my father, which were, "Tell the boys not to forget me." And I realized a half century after that I hadn't forgotten my grandfather, but I never really knew him like I wanted to. And I thought, why not write a story about his time and place, put him in it as the lead character, and find out a little bit more about what it was like to walk the streets of Wichita in 1937. What movies did he watch? What newspapers did he read? What was going on? Maybe I could understand and learn more about him. My grandfather was not a detective. That's pure fiction. But I wanted the backstory to be as accurate as possible. I wanted to know what was going on in 1937 Wichita. And we're often told as writers, write what you know. I didn't know 1937, and I'm still learning. I've always been fascinated by the Depression years, but I'm still learning. I just didn't know about the city at that time. So my first stop was the Wichita Public Library, absolute first stop. And I still have a business card from Michelle Inke that I collected on that first trip. And she showed me where the microfilms were, got me started on reading some of the newspapers from that era, Wichita Eagle. Gave me a wonderful map of 1940 Wichita that I use all the time when I'm running Pete Stone all over town. So I'm still very, very grateful for her help and at that time. Then I went to your convention webpage and saw your theme for this year, Big Think, Innovation, Inspiration, Impact. And I want to let you know that the librarians that I have visited with have inspired and impacted me in many, many ways. Kathy Buckman, for my latest book, I met Kathy at one of my readings and I visited with her and said, I'm really looking for some information about Wichita State University, then known as Municipal University of Wichita. I needed to know what the campus was like, what the buildings were like, what the student body was like. And she sent me to Sonora Jackson, her former student, who is at Wichita State University in the library. And between Sonora Jackson and Mary Nelson, also at Wichita State, I got a link for the yearbook from that era. and it was a 1937 yearbook, and it had absolutely everything I needed. I hadn't even left my home and had this wonderful resource at my fingertips. So I'm very grateful to those people. Some other names that popped up on your website: Bethany Odell, Terry Summy from Emporia State University, and Robin Newell and Molly Chenault and Emporia Public Library have all been very, very helpful and instrumental in my work in creating this character and his adventures. So thank you all. Thank you all for what you do. So now I'm in 1937 Wichita, and I wanted to learn more about the places I say. My wife and I visited many of the museums in town, been very, very helpful. We went across the street from when the public library was on Main Street. We went over to the Wichita Sedgwick County Historical Museum. And there's a wonderful collaborative website that you have created. It's between Wichita Public Library, Wichita State University, and the Wichita Sedgwick County Historical Museum, called wichitaphotos.org. And there are hundreds of photographs from just after the Civil War into the 2000s. And so I keep that on my homepage. And when I need a little more information or backstory for my work here, I click on the photographs and look through, and I'm constantly inspired by some new photograph that I see. For example, I'm working on a 4th manuscript right now, and I wrote a sentence: I drove to my office downtown. Very boring. I drove to my office downtown. I wanted to give it a little more color, a little more detail. So I went to wichitaphotos.org and looked at a couple of pictures and replaced that sentence with this: I crossed the river and drove east into downtown. At Douglas and Main, 2 clerks in shirt sleeves and bow ties arranged a display of menswear in the window of Hinkle's Dry Good Company. At the northeast corner of Market and Douglas, customers milled on the sidewalk outside the entrance to the 4th National Bank. I glanced at my watch. The bank would open soon. I thought of Percival Gilman, the bank's cashier, and Agnes's husband, working inside the imposing structure, striving to gain the trust and confidence of his customers, ever vigilant of his image in the community. A quote from Jacob Marley's Ghost popped into my head: I wear the chain I forged in life. So one click, didn't leave the house, and I was able to turn a boring sentence into a paragraph that was a bit more descriptive. Thank you very much for that. We have visited the Kansas Aviation Museum, Historical Society, and there's another wonderful website, Wichita Landmarks. And even in this time of COVID, I'm able to continue doing my research. So I'm very grateful to all of you for what you've done, and I appreciate you very much. And I'm glad to have this opportunity to say thank you. Thanks a lot.